Good evening, everybody, and this winter's evening. So obviously now for the way I'm so badly lit. This is an IALD event today, and hosted by IALD UK and supported by our lovely Kat from ETC and Sean from 3LR. Thank you very much for your support on that. And our speaker today is David Atkinson, and the conversation we're going to have, or the presentation, is going to be recorded. Also, there's an ability to ask questions at the end. So if you do have any questions, you can raise your hand or put something in the comments box at the bottom, and we'll get round to that. So thank you all very much. So I think I'm going to sit back and relax and listen to what David has to say. So over to you, David. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you to the IALD, to Sean at 3LR, and to Kat at ETC for hosting tonight's presentation. So really, just going back to my 1980s is when I started in the world of theatre, perhaps a little earlier than that, but that was sort of the early start in local repertory theatre, and then going to train at a college. But basically, lighting was very much segregated in the early days into different disciplines, really. We had theatre lighting, we had film and television lighting, we had rock and roll show lighting, and finally we had architectural lighting, which was, at that point, was probably being run by the likes of Thorne and Phillips. But basically, I'm now going to take you through a few slides, but the common theme here, of course, is that, you know, all of these theatre, film, rock and roll, architecture, LED, which is amalgamated technology, has enabled us to do lots of exciting things now. So let me go to my next slide. Ping, ping. So this slide basically is, I hope you can see it, which is of film. Film, obviously, as well as theatre, has played a major role in my career, my vision. The images here, I just wanted to show you a couple. These are the black and white ones are from The Third Man, which I think is a fabulously lit black and white noir film. Point light, single point light sources. I believe they actually had very, very small budget on this film, and they actually used Second World War xenon, well, not even xenon then, carbon arc searchlights to illuminate the scenes. And, you know, it's very, very dramatic, beautiful lighting. And then the top right-hand image is obviously from Alien, underlit table, probably with fluorescence. And then the left-hand one is down at the bottom left, is from Blade Runner 2045, which I thought was a beautifully lit film. A lot of people didn't like it as a film, but I thought it was beautifully lit by basically by the cinematographer DP Roger Deakins, who really pushed the boundaries, and he has done some amazing films and is always very, very clever with lighting. Now, the next image, I will get on to theatre, but the next image, I just wanted to bring this in. The top left-hand image is actually a shot of Lloyd's of London, which was done by Andrew Bridge, the theatre lighting designer, who's worked with Imagination, but of course his claim to fame is Phantom of the Opera and a lot of the Lloyd Webber productions. A great lighting designer, and I learned a lot from him because I did some work with Imagination years ago, and you know, he was a very, very clever, still is, lighting designer, and he looked at Lloyd's and wanted to light it with filters, with blue filters, but obviously for longevity that was a major problem. So he turned to a chap called Bev Bingham, who worked at Lighting Technology at the time, who had a lamp which was made by Radian, which was an MBI blue. Now we've seen that now a lot over the years, and illuminated it. It's more of a mauvey blue, but it was a sort of the beginning of lighting buildings in colour, and it was a very dramatic effect. And they also used adapted France's searchlights, which were used in shipping with discharged metal halide lamps to put shafts of light up the building. Also on the top of that building, there are some blue cranes, which were illuminated with this sort of lightish blue, but because they're blue, they kind of fluoresce, which is an interesting technique I've played with, and you'll see that later in my presentation. That the image on the right is from I shot in Bologna, and it's just one of the colonnades, and I just thought how beautiful that is. bottom left is just a street scene in Italy, and then there's another lovely image there, just that orange fluorescence, and that I just took that photograph. I was just walking through a temporary structure at the Knightsbridge, and all they'd done is wrap the tubes in encapsulate sleeves, and I just thought, well, this is very clever, and it's very simple, and it's very theatrical. So theatre, it has been my guiding discipline. And so back in the 80s, when I was working with theatre, we rarely had a budget. I mean, the budgets were absolutely pathetic. So we used to have to beg and borrow everything we could get sometimes just to get a production off the line. And, you know, if we made a gobo, which would be a dappled light effects through profile fixtures, we sometimes make them out of Coke cans. And I believe people are still doing that. And just puncturing holes in it and putting in the gate of a fixture. And that was just, you know, how it was. But I've always had that in the back of my mind. You know, when QSs say to me, you've got no money for a show or a project, that's something I always, you know, go back to. You can make things happen sometimes with not huge budgets. And obviously, control of lighting was a major factor. And that's one thing which I'll come on to discuss in a minute, which is about how, you know, getting the right beam angles, acute angles, cross light, low level lights. If you're doing dance, you want a cross light at very low level, because with the human form, you just need to catch the side of it. And again, we can play all of these tricks in architecture. These are some of the old instruments. We used to call them instruments. I think that's what we called them actually, or fixtures, which had bubbles, i.e. lamps. We never called them lamps, we called them bubbles, which used to go inside these fixtures. These were made by old Strand Electric at the time, and you know, they're now popping up on eBay. But they're beautiful things, actually. Aesthetically, I love the look of them. But basically, we've got top right is a Fresnel, Fresnel, however you like to pronounce it, which gave us a soft edge beam, which we could obviously vary from 10 to 59 degrees, so you get nice soft spread, often used on stage, sometimes for cross light, sometimes for backlight. And then below that is a PC, a pebble convex fixture, and that's a really useful piece of kit. 10 to 59 degrees of spread on it, and basically I used to actually use those front of house sometimes in theatres because they've got such a narrow beam with them. But traditionally, I mean, in fact, you didn't get many theatres in the UK using them. They tend to come from France, actually. And then, of course, the ellipsoidal profiles, which obviously now you've got source 4s. At the time, then we just had these old 264 strand lights, which didn't have two lenses in them. They had one single lens, and used to have these comb shutters inside the fitting, so you could get a soft edge through the comb shutters. Very basic stuff. Good old floodlight down the bottom, and then a parcan. And then parcans, of course, came in really from the rock and roll world, came in from the States. They were used 110 volt in series in the UK for a long time, and then we started to get the 240 volt versions of them. And of course, you could just interchange the lamps because they were basically a sealed beam unit, so you could go from a very, very narrow, even an aircraft landing light, which produces a very, very narrow sort of 5-degree beam. Very useful tool, cheap as chips, really they were, because we used to have banks of them. And I remember drawing up a project for Patrick and Woodruff and Jimmy Barnett, which was for the Queen show, and there were banks and banks of parcans. So that's my claim to fame, I'd say. Going on from here, I would suggest any young up-and-coming lighting designer should read this book by Richard Pilbrow, which is a brilliant book. I'm not sure how many editions have been now, but I remember reading probably the age of 14. It's a great book, and of course it's been updated and now includes new designers in it as well. And it's a great book, well worth a read. So just going on to sort of tricks and of the trade, I would suggest using basically barn doors are a really useful tool. Barn doors can obviously, you can now use on lots of fixtures, and you can shape and control the beam of light that you've got. And also you've snoots, which is that on the left-hand side. That's a sort of a tubular device that goes on the front of a fixture. again, that controls the beam and stops any stray light, which sometimes you get from a narrow beam fixture. Very useful tools. And I've, lots of manufacturers have adapted fittings to accept these and are very useful. I mean, I worked for many years with people like Commercial Lighting Systems who've adapted a lot of their fittings to take barn doors. And of course, there are lots of theatrical manufacturers who adapt them for architectural purposes as well. So Gobos, in film, for example, on the right-hand side, that's an example of a fret cut piece of MDF, which you would then just put a Fresnel fixture behind and fire light through it to get, your dappled light or your shaft of light or whatever else. And that's the traditional way of doing a gobo. Obviously, in theatrical terms, you tend to use a gobo in a profile fixture, which is great for beam effects, but also for projection. The problem in film, sometimes they don't like using that because you get sort of blue edges to it. But on the whole, it's something that obviously I'm now using a lot in a lot of my work architecturally. So a lot of the source 4s have been adapted, obviously, to work in architectural scenarios. This is just an example of images of in nature, the natural gobos, but this is something we're trying to replicate all the time, of course. Going on to diffusion and light shaping filters, LSFs, they are really important to me because often, you get to site and you might have specified in architectural terms a fixture which is giving you maybe I don't know, 30 degrees, and you need to spread it out a bit. You need to create an elliptical beam. It's too late. You can't go back because a lot of these lenses are fixed. So by using diffusion filters, which are now being designed specifically for LED, is a very useful tool for us now. So the likes of obviously Roscoe, Lee, and all the big manufacturers have taken this on board for the LED market, and it's very useful. Coloured glass and filters. I mean, when I first came out of theatre and started doing permanent installations, I worked on a thing called Powerhouse, which is an enormous inflatable structure, and Orskard's Parade, which is all about the best of design in the UK. And we wanted to illuminate this in sort of a deep, deep dark blue, almost what we call an ultraviolet blue. But of course, by using filters, you couldn't really do that because the filters would literally burn out, because putting it in front of a 400-watt metal halide light wouldn't work. So what we actually did, we didn't actually use the blue lamps, which we used on Lloyd's, but we used dark blue filters, and we basically got a Siemens to adapt a fitting that they did with Euroflood, and we fitted toughened, and it had to be toughened obviously because it would crack otherwise, dark blue filters. But I have found it's quite interesting, but sometimes using dark blue filters, even with LED technology, they burn out. And it's not about burning out, it's just about the intensity of light on the back of which tends to almost bleach out the colour. So I have been using dark, blue filters, glass filters, or dichroic filters, tend to be just solid glass filters, which has been a useful tool. But again, I'll come on to this. You'll be interested to see in a minute how we've used filters in architectural projects. So just a few of the tools. Good ETC, here we are, promotion, your lovely little mini source 4, very useful for the museums in lots of architectural areas because it's controllable. You've got shutters, you've got gobos in it. Great piece of kit. Bottom right, again, another ECC product, which is effectively almost like a Fresnel. So you can adjust the beam angle. So again, that's really useful. A piece of kit because you can use that and it's got future proofing built into it. So if you've got a project where you need, you're lighting a museum where you also want to light something with a 10-degree optic, you can adjust it to 10 degrees. If you've got another project coming in after on the back end of it and it needs to be 24, you can just adjust it rather than having a range of lots of different beam angle fixtures. So it's very useful that. And then, of course, just over to the left, my favourite little piece of kit, which was, I think, originally designed by Light Projects, which is a little PAR 16 known as a birdie, because it was the baby version of the big PAR. And very, very useful little piece of kit. Not that expensive. I think this particular one was about £25 sterling, fitted with a GU10 lamp, and you know, that could be useful. Aesthetically, it looks the part as well, so it's a good piece of kit. So going on to some of my work now. So with this is Diaghilev, which is the Ballet Rouge project, which I did at Victoria and Albert Museum, which was designed by Drinkle Dean and Tim Hatley, who's a stage designer, set designer. And it was a fabulous project to work on. So we did utilize quite a lot of theatrical lighting, as you can see in this image at the top there, because we had to light this enormous backdrop. And it was quite a hard job, because we weren't allowed to bring the lights out terribly far from the backdrop. I mean, normally I don't want to be out by a few meters, and I couldn't, so I had to adapt to look at asymmetric floods to light the top part, and then we had to use frosted fixtures with, again, going back to the use of diffusion to get light down to the bottom. But it was a really exciting, of course, this was so theatrical, this project. Top right image here was a little sort of stylized image of the set of a backstage area, all the chairs all piled up. And then we just backlit that with a load of fluorescent tubes, which were just wrapped in the color. Very simple, and then illuminated the objects and props with from a track above, a lighting track with some fixtures fitted with colored glass in different tonal colors. And then the bottom left is an image of we had a fleecy cloud projector, which again is a theatrical source, which is a big piece of glass which is etched with an effect of fleecy clouds, literally. And so I think it's actually a black and white image almost. And then we just put a metal halide source behind it, which was actually the metal ETC source for metal halide. So we could then just project this sort of soft image across the back. And then we used lots of prop lights, which were really useful, from this wonderful guy called Jim Laws, who had a shed or a barn full of old theatre lights. And the theatre lights in the top left-hand corner are from the Royal Opera House. And we adapted those to take domestic lamps so that they would last the run of the show. This is a project which I did with Hara Clark, Robin Clark, and it was for Emma Hamilton, who was Lord Nelson's mistress. And basically, this is again, this is what we did here: is we have these stylized windows which we back illuminated, so you can see the shadow of those, and then we sort of enhance that by projecting gobos of Georgian windows on the floor. So the whole thing is, I mean, this is pure theatre, and it's in the Maritime Museum. A nice project to work on. And again, we can just see slightly to the left there as we use an electrical lens on a fitting, and just put a little salmon filter in there, just to sort of bring out the back wall there. So, and then obviously lit all the exhibits, and obviously when working in museums, you've got to work very closely with conservation lighting levels, which is around 50 lux or whatever, depending on the objects you're lighting. This is a bit more contemporary. This is Postmodernism at the V&A, which was an exciting project to work on. Again, we used lots of architectural off-the-shelf fittings. So we've got light boxes suspended on the top left, with a little bit of backup and some track lighting just to light exhibits. On the right, we've got neon signs, and then we've got some just some relatively inexpensive RGB pars, which just were all programmed to change color because it was a dynamic. They wanted it to look like Studio 54 in New York. Postmodernism, again, we used neon, and then we had edge-lit Appalec panels, which were for graphics. And the thing about doing museums, I always start sort of back to front in some respects, light the object labels first. If your audience can't read object labels, that's it. You'll have major problems. So then everything else can work around that, and obviously then illuminate the objects and then illuminate the space. So it's sort of that's the process. This is what I call an immersive project. This was a project we did in Japan with Land Design Studios, and it was basically for the UK Pavilion. And what we had here is basically, I mean, we had a really tight budget. There was no money. And so we had these fret cut panels mounted all the way around the space, and they were back illuminated. They were backed with silk, like a silk material, and then we backlit them with literally fluorescent battens, which are four-way battens. So we had red, green, blue, and amber, or yellow actually. So we could create these dynamic, immersive colours within the space. Gloss floor, projection on the ceiling, some inexpensive downlighters, job done. So it was just really just a simple palette of tools that we used here. This is the Backstage Bar at the O2, which I did in conjunction with RPM and Venture 3, the branding companies and design company for Sky. And basically, when we first arrived to do a recce at the O2, this was literally a black, sort of dingy, dusty space. And it was decided that lighting and hung suspended pieces was going to be the way we were actually going to make this into an immersive, exciting area for hospitality. And it's all basically above the bar there. Those were literally corrugated plastic polycarbonate panels, which are normally used in sort of greenhouses and conservatories, which we cross-lit with color changing sources. And then back illuminated these panels here, which are literally Barasol ceiling panels, which we back illuminated with LED sources. So, and also obviously with it being used for corporate events, they could just change color. I mean, it was in the early days when this was done. I never forget, there was a panic one afternoon and they rang me to say, we need to change the color of the space. And I said, well, the programmer is actually in his car driving down to the south of France. He pulled off the road and logged into their server and changed it to the color they wanted to, which is impressive at the time. So going on from here, this is now real architecture. This is a project I did for Foster and Partners and for Expo in Milan, and it's the UAE Pavilion. And going on to the next image, this is the exterior of the building. It was like a foliage which led you up to this central drum, and the exterior of it was all made of GRC. And initially we were looking at having uniformity in the way it was going to be lit. There were asymmetrical adjustable fittings in the ground, and we just wanted to get, you know, initially it was like, oh, this needs to be uniform. But then the budget was tight. We ended up having individual fittings and not as many as I wanted to initially, but then we played around with it. We thought, you know what, this is going to work because it's, again, it's the less is more factor. And this is how it kind of came alive. But then what really came alive was the central drum, which was made from this taku material. And we did a lot of experiments with it. And just going on to my next slide. So we did tests out in Italy. We had spray panels, which was sort of matte sprayed, and then another panel, which was sort of semi-sheet, had a bit of a sheen to it. And then we had the taku in the middle. And then what we did is to bring different sources along. So we started off with a narrow beam source, which was interesting. It looked pretty dramatic, but obviously it wasn't getting the spread naturally, and we were just going to space them out, but we didn't think that worked particularly well. So we then looked at side by side, we had a flood source, and then we had basically a linear source, and these were from Guzzini. And so what we then did is, it was still looking okay, but then we did something which was magical. We added a filter. We literally used a standard theatrical filter, and I'd obviously preempted this, and we took a load of filters along. And immediately we added that filter, you can see from this image, suddenly this material came alive, and it from being quite flat and not particularly exciting at night, this was the route we went. So it was, you know, going from, obviously that's without the filters, but it shows you the uniformity we were getting. And then we did some renders. But what's interesting, I always say about renders, is that, you know, in a Dialux calculation or whatever, you look at it literally, and of course you're getting, between the fittings, we were getting dark spots. But actually in reality, on site, no, we weren't, because it was bouncing off all sorts of surfaces. And this is the result. So what we had was this very dramatic color coming down, hitting the ground, and then bouncing off into the GRC wall, which is surrounding, encompassing this drum. And of course, it was really exciting. And actually, you know, it just kind of happened. It wasn't planned that we were going to get this refraction and various things playing off the, you know, so it's often light is sometimes incidental. And, you know, again, that's what happens in theatre, because you experiment in theatre. And I know it's difficult in architecture to do that, because, you know, once you've fixed your position, you fixed your position. But lighting trials are so important. And I really encourage people to do that. This is a project I did in Gibraltar. Again, bit of theatre, adding gobos, huge grass area, which the landscape architect said, what are we going to do with this? And I said, well, let's have a think about this. So we just threw gobos across it. And what's really interesting is at night, people go and have picnics within, you know, in this dappled light, you know, this dappled moonlight, which is, you know, really exciting. And the back wall we illuminated with shafts of light. Again, we were going to uniformly light that back bastion wall, which is a beautiful wall, which is a listed wall. But we ended up having narrow fixtures mounted along the wall. And, you know, again, that's a bit something as a technique I used to use when we were doing rock and roll shows, when we used to have just fingers of light going up the back cyc. So yeah, that's, and then this is, you know, just a montage of some of my slides, but the slides I've shared with you are just an indication really of what can be achieved, and we've considered use of light through control, color, projection, and of course by limiting the number of sources used. But it's just really important just to think about also the possibilities of adapting existing architectural fittings where you can. And what's really great now is, of course, you know, again, I will mention ETC, of course, but they have a back end, an LED light engine, which can now be retrofitted onto a lot of their older fixtures. So it's about, you know, recycling. There are lots of theatres in the UK who cannot afford to switch to LED, but they've got some beautiful instruments, great pieces of kit, and they can be adapted. And, you know, there are people out there doing it. And so I say, you know, recycle where you can, and, you know, utilize, you know, the technology which is there. Thank you very much.
I had to unmute myself, David, which is, yeah, for me, yeah, I think my husband would like that option to mute me often. David, I've known you for a very long time, and your work is probably my favorite work of any that I have ever seen ever in my 25 years plus in the business, mostly because I think you take such a delicate touch to what you do. You interpret it, and one of the words I didn't think I heard you use was layering. It seems to, you know, you're using quite a lot of layers to tell a story, you know, the background, the foreground, the bits in between, and some texture and stuff. Is that, am I right in that?
You're absolutely right. Lighting is about layers. It's absolutely about layers. You've got to start with your basics and then you work. I mean, in theatre, you kind of, you know, if you're starting up, as I call upstage on a show, you're looking at your cyclorama, you illuminate that, then you come forward of that, you know, if you're working in reverse. And yeah, it is about layering. Lighting is all about layering, but it's not about quantity. It is about the quality of the light. So I will never forget, I mean, Andrew Bridge was the classic. I had lunch with somebody this week in the theatre, and we were talking about him, and his approach always was, you know, he would stretch a lighting instrument to do so much. You know, it would be used in so many different scenes at different lighting levels or whatever. Obviously now we've got moving lights, we can do all sorts of things, and that's something I haven't mentioned. I wasn't going to talk too much about moving light technology because that's, you know, that's all come in. I tend to be a little cautious of using moving lights in permanent installations, because purely on the maintenance factor is that, you know, I'm concerned if I walk away from a project that's sitting in the Middle East, will it get maintained? You know, and that's why I tend to be cautious of using intelligent, you know, moving light technology. But you're absolutely right. Layers are really, it's everything about light. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think also from the way I do my work as well, anything that I do, I quite like doing things in a long-handed way, because I feel like all of the processes accounted for. Which sometimes, if you can use these new toys that we've got, like that are very clever, you can kind of miss out some of the nuances, which I think is very much evident in your work. You know, it's all too easy to just say, let's, you know, light a building in bright green or orange, but without going through these kind of learning processes. I've got a question that's come up. The use of gels is very interesting. How do they hold up over time, especially in terms of degrading or replacing them?
Well, it's interesting on that point, because I did raise that, talking about that project, which I did when we used a dark blue filter, for example. I need to have the conversation with the likes of Roscoe and Lee about that. But I know that, for example, they have created a range, both of them, for tonal filters almost. So it tends to be down the warmer end of the spectrum. So, and I mean, I don't know about the longevity of those, but I mean, I think they're designed to, you know, be pretty stable in terms of, you know, not degrading too much.
What about in terms of using, so you said instruments, and it reminded me years ago, we used to say instrument glass.
Absolutely.
Probably why they were called instrument glass, thinking about it. So what about glass filters?
Glass filters is the way I you know, playing safe. You know, we always used to use, you know, obviously still use dark glass filters in certain scenarios. But I think, you know, that certainly with frost filters, etc., you know, you can probably use you can use sort of plastic filters for that. But I think it's experimenting, and also I think one should do some soak tests, to be honest with you. That's the other thing to do with certain filters. It's all down to the, you know, when you've got such an intense, we had a, you know, literally a sort of a little tubular track spot, which we fitted a filter into, and it was a fairly narrow beam on the fixture, probably about a sort of 12 degrees. But it was the intensity of on the back of the filter, which is effectively just, it bleached. It just literally didn't burn, it bleached.
Yeah.
Obviously the dye, you know, in certain colours, but certain colours are stable. Yeah.
Some colours don't like to be pushed, so do they? Red doesn't like to be pushed very far. It's got very low transmittance, hasn't it, red?
Yes, it does, but that was more about, with the LED technology, it's slightly different. Obviously, you're looking at a, you know, we're in a different world now with that, because obviously.
Well, I guess LEDs, I mean, that's what LEDs are born to do, I guess. The diode was red, so I guess that's kind of answered our question with that one. What project are you most proud of, do you think? Was it a small budget thing, or was it the big budget?
It often is. I mean, you know, it has been these smaller budget, like, you know, from a theatrical perspective, I'd say Diaghilev, which I absolutely loved doing. That was a lovely project. That wasn't a huge budget, working with some really great creatives. And I suppose the Foster's building, which was also, we had a whole visitor experience inside it as well, which I did as well. So I was doing architectural and the interior, and that was a great experience. You know, it's fantastic. You know, those were a couple that I can pick out, but I mean, there are many. It's a lot of projects out there, but you know, they were really good. I mean, there was a hotel I did many years ago with Ron Arad. And that was really, I mean, that's still there. It's the Duomo Hotel in Rimini, and that was very theatrical, very theatrical, very exciting, great.
And I was just going to say, happy accidents happen, don't they? Sometimes when you're in that kind of, well, hopefully not necessarily on the commissioning stage, but maybe before you can capture those, and then you can learn from them. Because sometimes the computers, they don't necessarily pick up every single thing, or you do get to site and sometimes that's something strange, that the white carpet's now a black carpet, or
exactly, or you don't know what's around you. I mean, last night I was running a lighting test on the building, and we were looking at the building, and there was, you know, the light was working pretty well, but there was something bleaching it out, and there was a work light just about 500 yards away. So, you know, that's what it was. So, you know, you just it's, you know, light is often incidental, you know, that's the thing about it.
Yes, I think definitely. And I think mock-ups, even with all the tools that we have, are still very essential.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Everybody's been very good. I mean, I think people now are going back to work and have done a day's work.
I'm
And
sure they have.
had a lovely amount of people come to watch. So thank you very much, everybody. If anybody has got a question, and I'm not being rude or not good enough to operate all my buttons. I do have a question actually from Sean. He said, "What drives your inspiration? Is it aesthetics or storytelling or both?" Excuse the dog.
What drives it? God, I don't know. I think what drives it is the people I work with on the projects, and that's what I go into. I think what's really exciting for me about projects is I go into have the brainstorm with either architects or with designers, and just sitting there sketching out ideas, pulling up stuff off Pinterest, and then perhaps taking it on from there to experiment with lighting, getting a light. I never getting into a meeting once, and I just, in the early days of RGB LED strips, for example, somebody gave me one and I had it in my pocket or my bag. I just took it out and I said, well, we can do something like this. And we'd illuminated it in sort of, switched it to green. And I went, oh, great, that's it. And suddenly everything started coming together. Yeah, so yeah.
Do you think that might be because some people can only understand what you're doing when they see it?
Yes.
Like as a picture or like instead of just words.
Yeah. We know what it's going to look like. We can produce, renders. We can produce. I always say this is the thing about doing renders and slick InDesign documents and everything else for people. But at the end of the day, it's if let's say you're doing a project in the middle of the desert or something, it's about going out there with a light on a bit of cable or whatever it is, on a battery powered, whatever it is, and saying, this is what we're going to do. This is the effect we're going to get. And you just play around. And also it's really important, I believe, as a designer, not to exclude your client, because the client, if they have a say in the project as well and feel that they're a part of the process, that's really, really important. Sometimes you don't want that. I know that. Sometimes there's a tricky client and you don't want that. But on the whole, if you can, I remember years ago working on a project where I was pre-warned that the client could be tricky. He had a lot of ideas about lighting, but I made sure I brought him into the mix at a very, very early stage when we were experimenting and doing lighting trials. And from there on, he was on board.
I actually was at a meeting today as well. And one of the things that came out was the use of light fixtures that can be recycled or changed or updated as they go through their life. And one of the questions from the young designer to me was, how would you try and talk to a client if you wanted to use these second-hand fixtures in a project? What would you as the first go around, not in terms of recycling them in the project that already exists, but as a new client, new build, to say, a bit like a charity shop, we're going to go and use charity shop fittings in your project. Would that be something that you would, you think the world might change that way?
I think the world should change, because I think with COP, we've got at the moment COP26, it's absolutely, I mean, years ago, when I started out in lighting, I was working at a theatre lighting hire company in London, and I was told to literally go and throw a load of lovely old lights in a skip and get them, they go off to be destroyed. And I even from that day, and then we're talking about 1981 or something like that, people were doing that. And I just say, why? Because, they've got a life. You can, they're beautifully, a lot of these old lights, for example, are well engineered. And even contemporary lighting is very well engineered. I think it's really important. And I think clients will come on board with that. Okay, it might be a bit scratched and dented. Well, it goes back to the manufacturer, it gets resprayed, it gets a new light engine in it. And I think that is definitely the way forward. I definitely promote that.
Sorry, I'm just... Right, my little fingers are working faster than the machine wants to do. So I'm muting and unmuting myself in equal measure. I think we've come to the end of our session today, and I could talk to you all night. Thank you so much. maybe we could get you back again to
pleasure.
to do another one, or maybe an in-person one.
Absolutely.
With real people would be great if anybody's up for that. So thank you very much from our sponsors of tonight, ETC and 3LR, and from the IALD. And I hope to will see you again soon. We are going to have industry drinks in London on the 9th of December for anybody that's interested. DM me on Emma Cogswell on my LinkedIn page. I'd love to see you all. And thank you very much and good evening.